Good morning, Jackie. I am delighted to introduce you to my guest, Member of European Parliament Danielle Hannan, who will be here at the conference to speak, along with former U.S. Ambassador David Wilkins, to speak about the state of conservatism outside of Canada, in this case, Europe and the United States. But the reason I'm delighted to have you here today is that I've been following your career for a number of years now, and I have always noted one thing about you is that you're always very cheerful. You're a very conservative member of the European Parliament, but one who's happy. You're like the happy warrior of European politicians, and you work in Brussels. You work in the European Parliament, which is very concerned with things like the curvature of bananas. That to me was the epitome of ridiculousness when it comes to a state getting in, busying itself with all kinds of ridiculous things that it has really no business doing. And yet you live in that world where people concern themselves with these nitpicking regulations, and yet you are always very cheerful and optimistic.
Yeah,
How do you do
it is depressing. Politically, it's incredibly depressing because you're losing all the time. The curvature of banana directives go through with kind of 95% votes in favour, and that becomes a bit soul-destroying. But I tell you what, Brigitte, I've noticed over time that the people whose political theories are the most relentlessly optimistic, who think that crime can be cured if only people are rich enough and so on, tend to be remarkably ungenerous and mean people in their private life. Not always, of course there are exceptions. Whereas those of us who have a more kind of Tory pessimistic view of human nature actually are quite happy in our personal relations. And I think it's important that we convey that. The world, as you say, is not as we would like it. If you're a conservative, there are a lot of things to complain about. And you can very easily fall into the trap of being angry, just emphasizing all the things that you're against. But if you want to win, if you want to carry people with you, the best way of doing it is to communicate a sense of a better tomorrow, to infuse what you're saying with that little breath of optimism. And
you do that very well, and you're becoming increasingly popular, especially on this side of the pond, because you were at CPAC in Washington, D.C. just last month, where you gave a speech, which I posted, by the way, on our blog, if you want to see the entire speech, very well received, where you talked about the importance of political institutions and political culture, and the institutions, in our case here in Canada, the Constitution as the guarantor of our basic rights and freedoms. And I wonder, how would you recommend for normal people to go from issues like the curvature of bananas or the temperature of the water in our hot water tanks and bring this back to the first principles of government, which should be our basic institutions? How should we go about that?
Well, I think we are very lucky as Anglosphere common law citizens, as citizens of English-speaking democracies, whether we're American, Canadian, British, Australian or whatever. We live in a system which is based on the principle that the government is subject to the law rather than the government being above the law and the law emanating from the state. We live in a system where, miraculously, hundreds of years ago, our ancestors developed this idea of a contract where the state was supposed to serve the rest of us rather than the other way around. That, by the way, made possible the multi-ethnic states that we now have. It allows people to come from anywhere and fit in as long as they accept the values. And that's made us, I think, a force for good. It's not to say that we haven't had our shameful moments, but if you look at the great ideological conflicts of the last couple of 100 years, there are not all that many countries that have a consistent record of having been on the right side. And the Anglosphere democracies, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom, with all of our occasional failings, we got the big calls right.
And that
comes from the institutions, right? It's not a genetic thing, it's not a geographical thing, it comes from getting the politics right.
So still a lot of good in our institutions, we just have to focus on them.
And you have to keep them. One of the things I envy is that you have in a federal system in Canada the kind of decentralization and localism that we used to have in the United Kingdom that has withered in the UK, and that I can see the beginning of that process happening here. And that's something that you really need to watch out for, because as government gets more remote, it gets bigger, it gets more expensive, and ultimately it becomes more oppressive.
Member of European Parliament Danielle Hannan, thank you very much. Enjoy your stay in Canada.
Thank you.
Back to you, Jackie.